Okay, good morning. This is Richard Shu, host of Shu Untied. This morning, I'm very pleased and thrilled to have with me as my guest Touraj, who's a former lawyer, also an entrepreneur, venture capitalist, advisor, angel, who's now written a new book called Exit Path: How to Win the Startup Endgame. Touraj, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much, Richard. Delighted to be on the show, and good morning to you.
Thanks. So let me just start by asking you, you've obviously done a lot of different things. What prompted you to want to write a book in the first place? Was it a childhood dream, or did the inspiration just come to you?
No, I've never actually, prior to writing this book, had an ambition about writing a book. But what happened was that throughout my career, I found myself in different parts of doing a deal in Silicon Valley. As you mentioned, I'm a recovering lawyer. So started out in the late 90s as someone who started helping entrepreneurs with deals as a contract lawyer, securities lawyer, and sort of saw how these transactions, mergers, and venture financings came together. Then I became a venture capitalist, and I kind of got my hand dirtier that way. And then I tried my hand at entrepreneurship in 2005 with my first startup, Jackster, which was an interesting wild ride in its own right. And then that was a bit of a bittersweet ending to that saga, because we hit the 2008-2009 downturn, and we had to do a fire sale of the company. And so a company that had a lot of promise, a lot of users, raised a ton of venture capital, I had to kind of shut it down or sell it for pennies on the dollar. I kind of took that experience and tried not to do the same mistake again in my next startup, and got very different results. And kind of then it dawned on me that having been on multiple sides of a deal, like especially selling a startup and how to build a startup, I was in a unique vantage point to write a book that captured those learnings, so that other entrepreneurs didn't have to make the same mistake that I did. I kind of wrote the book that I wish I had when I did Jackster.
Yeah, right. Well, what are some of the themes in the book? I mean, outline some of the themes that you try to cover.
Yeah, so basically, when you're an entrepreneur, the odds of success are pretty much against you. It's an open secret in Silicon Valley that 70% of venture-backed startups don't even return the money invested in them, right? And 90% of all startups actually fail, perhaps even more than 90%, if you look at ideas that don't even get off the ground. When you're facing that grim reality, what are success scenarios? Typically, it's either an IPO or an acquisition. Now, what's much less known is that for every IPO, there are 30 acquisitions each year. So the most likely success scenario and destiny for an entrepreneur is to be acquired. Yet, very few entrepreneurs seriously work on their exit strategy, especially exit by acquisition. And typically when they get to work on it, it's either too late, like I found myself with my first startup. We had only 6 months of runway left, and then we started banging on the doors of potential acquirers. It was way too late. Or they have to react to an inbound acquisition interest, like someone basically, they meet somewhere, or someone comes to them and says, hey, you guys are doing something interesting, do you want to talk acquisition? And then they're very ill prepared, because to enter into those conversations, it takes months, if not years, of advanced preparation. So what I'm advocating is to start early, to understand why having an exit is so existential and so important to your path, to your success, even if you decide not to sell your startup ultimately and do an IPO. Having the option to sell your startup would make you a lot more valuable and a lot more successful. And I kind of explore those themes in the book. And so I start with the mindset, and then I talk about the execution. How do you give mind share to your exit strategy.
Yeah.
And how do you basically make this a successful option, viable option, in case you ever need to sell your startup. So the book covers pretty much from soup to nuts, from getting started, why should you do it, who should you have on board, how do you even create an exit strategy, and how do you go about executing it. And then the last part of the book talks about really the tactics of deal negotiation, valuation, what are the various terms. M&A deals, as you know, are quite complex. Even though their term sheet may seem very simple, there's a lot hidden under the surface and between the lines that I try to kind of shed light on some of the traps for the unwary, and basically best equip a founder and entrepreneur to go through this journey.
So was it difficult writing this book? How was the process of getting this down, would you say?
Yeah, the process was actually much longer than I thought it would be. It took 5 years. And I don't think if the pandemic had not happened, I would have been able to finish it. But because of the pandemic, I had a lot more time because it cut down on commute, etc. I had a lot more kind of dedicated time, focused time to get into these topics. I started with an outline. The outline pretty much stayed the same, although I had a great editor at McGraw-Hill who suggested some changes which were spot on. But pretty much 90% of the outline that I started with, I finished the book with. But then the content and how you fill in and flesh out the book took a long time. And I think for perfectionists, that I probably put myself in that category, you're never done with a book. You need to have a deadline. You need to have an editor that says, look, this is good enough. It's time to ship. And yeah, it came out exactly a year ago, actually.
Interesting. And it's not industry specific, or how do you deal with that issue? Because I mean, are the issues the same for a life sciences company as it is for a tech startup or a software company or hardware and all that?
It's pretty much the same for much of it. Of course, there are some industry specific things, but each entrepreneur and each expert in their field would know those things best. What I touch on is the commonalities, the human element, the psychology of what it takes to sell a startup. And that's pretty common to all entrepreneurs. The fears, the taboos that get in the way, the myths about what an exit means, things that you need to watch out for, interests that you need to balance. For instance, your investors, your employees, your customers. How do you go about balancing those interests? Those are fairly common. But of course, the individual players, how should you think about an ecosystem? How do you create a strategic partnership? The specifics are different, but there are a lot of common themes. What I found actually is that some folks from not even startup world, I've had authors come to me and say, you know what, this was actually helpful for me to think about my negotiation as I go through kind of thinking about partnerships with various other entities or marketing my book. So there are actually themes that are fairly common to doing business and negotiation in general, which is relationships and creating leverage. And where does leverage come from?
So is your intended audience, a first-time entrepreneur, or is it more of an experienced entrepreneur? What's the intended audience?
I think even if you're an experienced entrepreneur, there is a lot first-time entrepreneurs. Of course, I would say it's I cannot emphasize enough for them to familiarize themselves with the topic and learn a lot more about exits and exit strategies. But repeat entrepreneur is not something that they typically deal with day in, day out. A lot of entrepreneurs are very much focused on the technology and innovation aspect, which is critical, but unfortunately not sufficient to create a successful outcome for themselves and their employees. So this is much more about the business and the psychology of negotiation, as I mentioned, in doing strategic partnerships, and ultimately planning for an exit. Like things come up, such as, for instance, you may get investor interest from strategic investors. Right now, actually, in this funding climate, you have a lot more active strategic investors than VCs. And so a lot of entrepreneurs worry about what would that entail with regards to their exit strategy, and does that scare other potential acquirers? How should they structure those investments? So those are themes that I touch upon in the book as well. And so having that framework can always help you think about long-term strategy and kind of how do you take incremental steps towards executing.
Mm-hmm. Now, I assume you've gotten a lot of feedback since the book has been out. It's been out for a year. What kind of feedback have you gotten?
It's been amazingly positive, and I think as an author, you couldn't wish for anything else. I think the feedback I've gotten is that for some entrepreneurs, they have literally called it a game changer for them, which just kind of I can never hear that enough. And that was really mission accomplished for me. I want entrepreneurs to succeed. I've always been a firm believer in entrepreneurship, innovation. I feel like actually, our collective future depends on it. We have our fair share of challenges in the world to tackle, from climate change to poverty to healthcare issues, rise of authoritarianism, you name it. And wherever you look and you poke, the real solution seems to come from entrepreneurs. So if more entrepreneurs can be successful, that's a huge thing. And I feel that by helping entrepreneurs really think about and understand what success means for them and for their companies, I think that we have a way to tilt the odds a little bit more in their favor.
Is there already a lot of other stuff you want to add after this come out? Because usually you thought of a lot of that you wish you'd added.
Well, one area that's been fascinating for me is the rise of AI and ChatGPT and AI tools, and how entrepreneurs can actually leverage that in their exit creation and execution process. That's been really fascinating for me. And also it's an area where a lot of people can make big mistakes. As I'm sure you know, a lot of these tools can generate false facts. And I mean, if I were to write the book today, I would dedicate a whole part to just the use of generative AI and tools like that in creating these partnerships.
Is there a second edition that could include that?
Not immediately. I sort of became an absentee parent during the writing of this book, so I promised my family to be a lot more attentive in the near term. So I don't have the heart to break that news to them, but it is something that's in the back of my mind, and perhaps I do more writing about it on LinkedIn or on my newsletter.
Yeah, right. Well, let me ask you, Touraj, you've done so many things. Obviously, we talked about, you're a former lawyer, you've been an entrepreneur, you're a venture capitalist, investor, now you're an author. What else is kind of on your career path list? I mean, you're still a very young man. What else is out there for you?
Well, I just like to support entrepreneurs. I like to help them, mentor them. That's why, for instance, I'm an operating advisor at Pair VC in Silicon Valley, working with a lot of young entrepreneurs. And the beauty of working with entrepreneurs is that each idea, each entrepreneur, each startup is a universe unto its own. And so you can never get bored or tired of that. It's just constant learning. So I love to learn new things, new industries. For instance, robotics, my current company, was a whole new industry for me, which I entered 2.5 years ago. And it's been fascinating to see how you can have an embodied AI through robots, and our robots do deliveries. And so I think you can stay forever young by just being close to innovation and entrepreneurs.
Well, Touraj, it's been a wonderful chatting with you, and I really appreciate the update. If you do decide to do something else, please come back and tell me about it.
Absolutely. Enjoyed our conversation.
This is Richard Shu and Touraj Parang. Thanks.
Thank you.